Refugees are people who have no choice in having to leave their homeland. Yeah? So it is a forced expulsion. That's the difference between a migrant and a refugee. A migrant could be a person who willfully leaves the homeland in search of better possibilities, or even if they are illusionary but nevertheless exercises choice. A refugee is a person who is driven out. Yeah? So there is no question of agency in becoming a refugee. And loss of home is the most important part of the refugee's existence thereafter. Like most refugees keep going back to this fact that the homeland that they were, which was an enforced flight for them. And refugees are always coming from contexts which are very challenging to the sense of the collective that was once unself-consciously lived by them. Yeah? It's only in a crisis situation will I think whether I am Hindu or I am Muslim or I am Sikh or whosoever I am. In a non-crisis situation, I don't think that. So I can go on existing. But when I begin to think about it, there must be trouble outside, because today now I have to think about who I am. And refugees have to think a lot about who they are, where are they coming from, what are the symbols of their life which are joining them together. There were many reasons, and it's a long story. Yeah, see, I grew up in Shimla, so very close to my home, my own house was the Tibetan Children's School. Yeah, so what is the TCV school? What is called Tibetan Central School, I think it is called there. And every year on the 10th of March, when we would be coming back from our school bus back at home, these children would be demonstrating. But I did not understand what they were demonstrating about or what the issues were that they were grappling with. And very early on in life, it seemed that they did not have something which we had. Yeah? So I think that was my first conscious emotional connection with Tibetan children as such. If I think further, I myself come from a refugee family, in the sense that my parents had were in West Punjab, yeah, which went into Pakistan subsequently after the partition of India. So I myself grew up with a lot of stories about how life was there. And many times when we were children, my father would, while he would be teaching us from our school notebooks, he would go back to memories of the home that he had left behind. Similar was the case. So my family was a partition family in which it was not like, silence was not the order, but there was often a reference to a world which they had given up. And so myself and my siblings, we grew up thinking about Lahore or thinking about Jhelum as much as our homes as New Delhi or Shimla. So there was at some level emotional identification. And in Tibet's case, China was the one which had been responsible. So there was a lot of soul searching, and there was also like thinking about what went wrong. Because I still have a lot of respect for Marxism. I still have a lot of respect for socialism. But then what happens which goes wrong in terms of implementation? Yeah? So what did communism not think about? These questions became like really questions in which my own ideals were challenged. I had to reflect upon them. So Tibetan case in that sense had personal linkages. It had the question of, I was also interested in Buddhism. Yeah? As a psychotherapist, healing is what I work with most. So how do individuals heal themselves? And here was a culture in which it seemed that their cultural values were in some sense or the other reparative for them. So all of this put together, I did not understand all of this when I started working with the Tibetans, but gradually over time, these are some of the reasons that come back to me. Yeah? See, I think the refugee is always the other side of the discourse of nationalism. Yeah? The more rigid national borders become, the more the refugee crisis escalates. Yeah, so in some sense, I think where we are in the world today, refugee has become almost like a global symbol of our times. Yeah? So it wouldn't be out of context to say that a large chunk of the world are today refugees. And it is sad that many nations are closing their doors on refugees, which I think that Indian nation always had much open borders and much more permeable ways of including refugees into the territory. And now with the Rohingya question, we find that we don't have that same kind of porousness. So I do think that on one side we have to think about what is the whole question of nation state and the power of the nation state as such, and then who is it that we throw out of the nation state, any nation states all across the world. So I think refugee in that sense is a very powerful symbol which should impel us to reflect upon the situation of the world, and also that refugees, we have to open our borders to refugees, because in one sense refugees are just like you and me. I mean, either of us could become refugees overnight. So refugee is somebody who is our other side, and I think that they are a huge challenge to whatever sense of stability or whatever notions of stability that we want to hold for ourselves. If we don't think about the refugee crisis, all issues of borders, nations becomes quite false and quite illusionary. See, one would have to do a more nuanced study of this to be able to say about the world at large. But my own experience says this, that refugees are generally not treated as equals. Yeah, they're not treated as, and they are very sensitive to this, yeah, because when they were part and parcel of their own country, they were like any of us, and suddenly they are divested of all opportunities and ways of being. So I think I don't mean to at all say that the host country will not have its own challenges or problems, or the host country does not have its own marginalized people or poor people, and say like a country like India, its hands are quite full with social problems. But when refugees come in and we make them, see, a refugee is inwardly already feeling like a beggar somewhere. Yeah? A refugee has lost it all, and very slight violences on our part can become like very huge issues in terms of their existential questions. I think that refugees are not only are they not given an equal status, far from it, they are not given an equal status, but also their host countries continue to many a times have humiliating attitudes towards refugees, and this can trigger for refugees their entire cycle of losses once again. So I do think that again this will depend upon whether there could be, I think the core issue in all of this is that one is politics. State politics is very, very important. Yeah? What is the politics of the country into which refugee influx is coming, and what is the human preparedness to take refugees in? And we can't do it in a situation of an emergency. This has to be part and parcel of our ongoing education. It cannot be that today the Rohingyas are coming and we say that today we begin to educate people on the refugee crisis. Our education has to look at some of these things as integral parts of how we are bringing up generations of our own people. So I do think that refugee question is a very complicated one, and the way that the refugee is made to think. To just give you an example from the Tibetans that I was working with, some of them said that that many of the Tibetans are in Himachal and in the Himalayan territories they are existing. So they would say that for instance, their market is burnt by the local people because there is a conflict. Yeah? There is a conflict between the two communities in which the Tibetans could have also been abusive or said something. But one community can burn the entire market. There are not very many experiences of that kind, but each time this happens, for them it is like they are once again destabilized completely. The sense of fear, the sense of not belonging, not being anyone, not having a sense of identity, all of them begins to pervade the refugee consciousness. And I think refugees are never granted first-rate citizenship. They are, at best we give them some small place for accommodation, and within ourselves we continue to by and large grudge it until and unless some countries take up the refugee question very seriously. I would think that this is a question which belongs to particular movements of refugees, where the issue is that this is the place in which we have to live our life hereafter. Sooner or later, people begin to accommodate and adjust to those cultures. That doesn't mean that their pain goes away, but the reality begins to dawn that this is our home subsequently. For groups where the hope of return is active, I don't think the question is that how long will they take. They don't want to settle. Yeah? Because if they settle, then they will have to give up the idea of the struggle, and their life themes are joined in keeping the struggles alive. So I think they want to remember that they don't belong here. That's what they would like to pass on to their children, so that the struggle does not end with them, but the struggle becomes like a living continuity across generations. So it will depend. For instance, like I would think like people who came from West Punjab, or who came from Bengal, which went into Bangladesh and which went into Pakistan, they realized that this is where they will stay. So they created theatre which was about their memories. They created many other forms of ritualization, and therefore that pain was symbolized in some sense or the other. But say take the case of the Tibetans, even if they are feeling comfortable, they have to remind themselves that this is not their home. Home is in their own land, and that is what they are futuristically looking forward to. So they don't want to settle, not that they can't. My take would be that 20th century in some sense has been a very violent century, because for the first time we have engineered ways of violence. Yeah? Earlier on, when there would be war and other things, we did not have a cold mechanical way in which millions of people could be killed. Yeah? And I think post Second World War, that is something which has shocked all of us, that you could kill lakhs and millions of people just in gas chambers, etc. So it has changed something about human consciousness the last century. And I think there also, if you think about, we always go back to the Holocaust and we always go back to Hitler's Germany, but I wonder whether any nation state is really very much better than that. So there also the question was of ethnic cleansing, there also the question was of purity, one race not to be mixed with another race, inferior races to be eradicated. So I think that when we say that when an influx of refugees comes in and our own nation would become contaminated in some sense, or it will change the demographics of the population, I think we are just missing the ethical point. Refugees are like compelling moral imperatives to us. Yeah? So I would think that the nation has to, if nation states have to survive, the nation states also have to enlarge in terms of their ideologies and the ways of their self-definition. Yeah? So on the converse side of the nation is always the exile, the one whom we don't want into the nation. So there is scope for rethinking this, and I think it's a very, very urgent task before us to think about what is the demography that would change. You know, if a few lakh refugees were to be amidst us, I think we are responsible for them. That's my take. This question about how much is too much is very difficult to answer statistically speaking, but I think we will have to find ways in which collective movements around refugees are created. That's my first take. My second thing is that, see, when refugees come in, the host nation has very little preparation about it. And every host nation also has its own issues with poverty, unemployment, marginalization. So people from within the host nation begin to resent the presence of the refugee also, and that becomes the context of a lot of intergroup tensions. Sometimes they are obvious and sometimes they are of an underlying kind. Yeah. So what is the preparation that the host nation does for its own self before or as refugees are coming in? That's also a very important question. Yeah, so can the host nation and the refugees talk to one another? Is there some way in which we can feel connected to what they are going through? I think then these questions will change. It will not become the question only about how much can be taken in. It will also become the question about how can we best take them in. Because I'm an Indian, I'm sure the answers that I would have got are somewhere close to truth, but not absolutely the truth, because they would feel, I don't know whether they would have found it completely possible to talk to me about this issue. I think the response is multidimensional. They do feel that in the initial years when they came, there was a good amount of kindness that the Indians showed them, 1950s, 1960s. They feel that even in the areas from which they were coming, whether that was Arunachal, whether that was Himachal, whether that was, you know, Darjeeling, etc., all of these areas from where they were coming, they felt that even if the Indians had less, they were ready to share with them. And there's a lot of gratitude in the older generation for the Indian people as such. Yeah? So they do feel that there was sharing. Indians came out of the way to teach them how to cook. You know, they were coming from a very cold region, so they could store meat for weeks and months. Now, they are such simple things, but when they come on Indian territory and if they are eating meat which is a couple of months old, they will get food poisoning and die. So, and a refugee, that is the level of chaos in a refugee's life, to think about everything that was familiar becomes suddenly unfamiliar. And in that, they feel that Indians, in spite of themselves being very poor, you can think about India in 1959, 1960. It is not like the modernized India of today, at least in our metropolitan cities, but they feel they treated them very well. Yeah? But India has its own challenges and its own problems with poverty. Yeah? So now when they feel that the Indians see them thriving better in business, yeah, it is difficult in some parts for the Indians to extend the same level of care or concern for them, and they see that many Tibetans are going towards the West. You know, so the comparison between what their nation has done for them and what is happening for the Tibetans, those become like areas of conflict within the Indian consciousness, and this is picked up by the Tibetans in a very adept kind of a manner. They understand that there is underlying conflict. They don't talk about it very openly. What is good is that in one-to-one level there are good friendships between Indian youth and Tibetans, but at political level I don't think India has ever taken up the question of Tibet, and that is what the Tibetans feel very troubled about. Yeah? That India has never said to China, just as no other nation of the world has said, that Tibet, you know, that free Tibet, or think about even like 4 times the Dalai Lama has in the last 15 to 20 years tried to talk to the Chinese administration that he wants to come for talks into Tibet, but China has not permitted that, and on each of the occasions the Tibetans have asked for international diplomacy to come within. And of course, because they've lived for so long in India, the expectation from the Indians is different than it would be from others. But no leader of India has ever been able to take a political stand on Tibet, and I think this is something they find it difficult to say because they are asylum seekers still. You know, they don't have the subject position to bring this up, but I do see that this is something which troubles us. And now with 55 to 60 years down the line, there are conflicts also, but I would not think that it's a very bad situation. There are underlying resentments, there are conflicts, but there are also friendships, there are also feelings of gratitude. Again, I would have to say this, that when I used to teach at Delhi University, I always felt none of my students in Delhi University, or very few of them, would ever come for a Tibetan protest or march. So, you know, you're sitting with those same people in your classes, but you don't, and they feel bad, you know, because everybody becomes a Chinky, everybody becomes a Chinese. So they feel that the identity for which they are fighting, that doesn't get recognized by their own classmates also. So I think it's a mixed bag. I think they have gratitude, they have good feelings towards Indians, and there are friendships, but deeper level, Tibetans have also kept themselves apart, and I think Indians have also not gone too close to understand not only the political issues, also the existential issues of refugees that much.